event is wonderful, absolutely wonderful. So we're so glad you're here and thank you for participating. Briefly, I will introduce our next speaker. Elizabeth Hennessy is one of our authors, and she's going to be talking about tips and tools to keep your story organized. Elizabeth?
Thank you all so much for having me. Like you said, my name is Elizabeth Hennessy. I publish under the name E.A. Hennessy. I am a young adult called Gregory's Gadget, which is book 1 of my Gaslight Frontier series. And today I'm going to go over some tips and tools that I use to organize my story, especially as I'm working on my second book. I realize that organization is very important. So these are sort of the tips and tools that I personally use to keep my stories organized. So some of the things I'm going to go over today. First, I'll be talking about, are you a plotter or a pantser? If those terms aren't familiar to you, don't worry, I'll go over what that means. But basically, it's talking about what type of writer are you, and figuring that out can help you determine which tools will be the most helpful to you. Then I'll go on to some of the common challenges that writers run into as we're trying to prepare our stories, and what tools you can use to tackle those challenges. So what the heck is a plotter or a pantser? So if you're a plotter, then you're a writer who likes to start out with a plan for your story. You might develop an outline, come up with all of your characters' general plots beforehand, and then as you write, you try to stick to that plan as much as you can. On the other side, if you are a pantser, then you write by the seat of your pants. So you don't really start out with much of a plan, you just sort of find where the story is going to lead you, and just kind of go from there. So, some of the challenges that you can run into if you're more of the plotter end of the spectrum, which I personally tend to be more of a plotter. So coming up with that initial outline can be somewhat overwhelming. You're trying to figure out what's going to happen in your story, where are all of your characters going to go, what's the end game that you're working toward, and sometimes that can be really overwhelming when you first start out. Another issue that you can run into is if you stray from your outline and then you can feel lost. Maybe you made a change and now the rest of your planned story doesn't make sense anymore and you have to figure out where you're going to go from there. On the other end, you could stick so strictly to your outline that your story actually feels sort of forced instead of feeling like a natural progression of plot lines and events. If you tend to be more of a pantser when you write, you might find yourself running into stories that sort of go off into the distance, not really having anything to do with what the rest of your story is about. They might just not lead anywhere. You might also find yourself having a lot of plot holes and inconsistencies since if you don't have enough organization with your story. You also might just find a point where you're writing and suddenly you realize you have no idea what you want to do next. And this is your classic case of writer's block. So what tools are there? If you're someone who tends to like starting with an outline, that's probably something that comes a little bit naturally to you, at least to an extent. Depending on your style, you might prefer to do a handwritten outline, or maybe you like to work with note cards or post things on a corkboard, or you might prefer to use some sort of digital means. You might type up an outline in Word, or you might use some pieces of software, which I'll go over in a bit, which types of software I personally like to use. And those outlines, you basically just plot your major events, your major plot points, where your characters are going, how to get point A to point B, what your end game is going to be in your story. So some of the software I personally really like to use, the first one is called Scrivener. And Scrivener is sort of like a word processor, but it has way more capabilities than something like Microsoft Word has. So it allows you to do a whole lot of different things from an outlining perspective and also from a normal word processor perspective. And I'll go over that more in depth in just a moment. And the other software I like to use is called Aeon Timeline. And this is kind of what it sounds like. It's a timeline software. And it actually lets you plot out on a timeline all of your plot events. So you could put maybe a plot line for each character, or the plot line that's happening in a certain area geographically in your story. And you can keep a visual track of what's going on. So here's some screenshots of what Scrivener looks like. This is their corkboard view. So there's actually 3 different versions there. If you're very into personalization, Scrivener's great for that because you can personalize the backgrounds and the shapes of the cards and things like that if that's something that you enjoy. But basically what this view does is it lets you have a corkboard just like you would if you had a physical corkboard. You can have these digital note cards with different plot points. You could have them with each of your characters. In the center view here, you can see there's like some images if you like to have inspirational images. So that's one view in Scrivener. The other view that's very helpful, this is their somewhat more traditional word processing view, but with a little bit extra. I'm actually just going to slide this out just for a moment so I can point over here. So for over here on the left, there's sort of this outline folder system that you have within your project. And it's a little hard to see, I know, from a distance, but you have these folders, and within the folders you have individual documents. So the way I personally use this is I'll have a folder that's either for a certain day that's occurring in my story, or later on I might organize it into my actual chapters for the final book. And then each of these documents inside will be a scene. And the thing that I love about this organization is that if you, say, write a scene and you decide, oh, actually I want that scene to happen earlier in the story, or I want it to happen later, you can actually just click that and you can drag it wherever you want, as opposed to in Word where you'd have to find it, copy, paste it, worry that you lost text or pasted over something, which is always my sort of paranoid concern with that software. So it's just a lot easier to shuffle things around here. And then over here, these are actually 2 documents that the author had opened at the same time, which is another very convenient thing to do. So you can have, in this view, it looks like they had maybe a marked up version over here, and then they cleaned it up in a second document over here. And just like in Word, you know, you can have highlighting, you can have, these are called annotations. So all those types of markup tools are in Scrivener. Another way that I use this sort of side-by-side view is if maybe you have a story that you had to do a lot of research, you can open up your research document in one, and you can have your writing document next to it, so you don't have to keep closing windows and flipping back and forth. It's just all right in front of you. And then this is a screenshot of Aeon Timeline, which I realize is a little bit dark. But in this example, I basically created 3 plots, if you can see them. The first one is in green, the second's in yellow, and the third is in blue. So you can have, let's say each one of these represents a character. And maybe plot point 1, they're at a party that's lasting however many hours. Or you can have a plot line that's just a single point. You have that capability. You could also do, if you have different locations in your story where characters are doing things simultaneously, which is what I've run into with my story, you can sort of see, like, okay, well, on this day, I know where this character is, but where did I leave off with this character? You can plot them out on here so you can see where their different plot lines intersect. So if you're more of a pantser, when you're working on your first draft, those sort of tools might not be immediately useful to you, unless you're doing something like finding writing prompts and inspirational images, in which case you might, say, use Scrivener to gather all of those together. And those types of things you can find very easily online with a quick Google search. You can also find lots of books out there that have writing prompts. You can find genre-specific ones. I've seen books that have, you know, if you're a fantasy writer, it's all fantasy writing prompts, or sci-fi, or maybe you're more of a personal story writer, you can find personal story writing prompts. And then after you finish your first draft is when these organizational tools can come in handy even more as you move on to editing your rough draft and creating your second draft. You can use those tools to then review what you did in your first draft and figure out what tweaks you want to make, find those plot holes, figure out what threads sort of went nowhere, or maybe you discover that a thread could actually be woven back into the plot line. You can use those tools for that. So the software that I talked about, I personally first discovered because I take a part in National Novel Writing Month, also called NaNoWriMo, and that's actually happening next month. It's the month of November. And if you've never heard of it, it's a yearly event that happens every November, and the goal is to write 50,000 words over the course of November, which is a very fun challenge. And so if you reach your 50,000 words, then you're considered a winner. And they have a lot of sponsor offers on their website, and Scrivener and Aeon Timeline are two of the sponsors that they have every year, and that's how I originally got the software. So for Scrivener, it's actually really great because they have a free trial going on right now if you wanted to just try the software, not spend any money on it to see if you even like it. And then anyone can use the code NaNoWriMo to get 20% off. And then if you're a winner, they'll send you a code to get 50% off, which is what I did. And similarly with Aeon Timeline, you can use Rimo 2017 to get 20% off of that software. And I'm not affiliated at all, I just really like the software. So I thought I would let people know the discounts that are available. All right, well, thank you guys so much. If anyone has any questions, I would love to answer them. Yes. Oh yeah, so the question is to elaborate on what a writing prompt is. So they come in several different forms. Sometimes, I don't know where it went. Sometimes a writing prompt will be just a statement, like maybe imagine what would happen if a princess was kidnapped, or something like that. Or sometimes it will be just the start of a sentence that you then finish, or it might be just a collection of characters in a certain scene. But the idea of them in general is just to give you some little seed for a story, some starting point to go with. Yeah, so I found them just searching on Amazon, really. You can find all different books if you want a physical book, or there are websites out there if you just Google search, fantasy writing prompt. There are a whole bunch of websites that's what they exist for, is for giving people writing prompts. Yeah, it's a really helpful resource if you're struggling to come up with a new idea. Welcome. Yes.
When you're formatting, are there advantages to formatting in Scrivener versus Word, or if you're self-publishing?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was, what are the advantages of formatting in Scrivener versus using something like Word? And that's actually one of the things I really love about Scrivener, is that it has an export feature where you can basically compile your entire story in Scrivener, and you can click export, and it will actually create the MOBI or EPUB or PDF file of an ebook, or you can export it to a paperback format. So that's actually an extremely helpful feature when you're getting ready to publish, especially if you're self-publishing and doing the formatting yourself. It's a lot easier. It's just really a couple clicks in Scrivener to set that up. Anything else?
As a follow-up to that, if you're familiar with Word already, how difficult was Scrivener in getting up to speed on it? I'm assuming that the word processing function is fairly consistent with Word. If you're fairly savvy in Word, I just haven't made the jump, so I'm trying to decide whether it's worth having to learn a whole new software or the benefits will be.
Right, so when I first downloaded Scrivener, I had just been using Word before that, and I pretty much started out just using it like Word, and you very easily can just do that. The formatting options and things are very similar to Word. And then as I sort of moved along in preparing my story, I basically just thought of what feature would I think would be useful, and I looked up to see if Scrivener had that feature. And most of the time it did. So I sort of learned as I went, and if I wanted a new feature, I looked in. They have tutorials online. When you download Scrivener, they have a really good manual that you can go through to find all of their features. So that's sort of how I went about it, is just what do I need to do next and what does Scrivener have to help me with that. Otherwise, I've talked to some people who have downloaded Scrivener and felt immediately overwhelmed because there's so much that Scrivener can do, and they feel like they need to learn everything all at once and just have everything that it can do just sitting in their head all at once, and that can be very overwhelming because it does have a lot that it can do. So for me personally, it was helpful to kind of learn one thing at a time and familiarize myself with the software. Yes. So I believe right now, and I think they're working on this, if you have Apple products, you can have it on your Mac and your tablet and iPhone. They do not, as far as I know, have an Android version of that yet, but I think that's in the works. Eventually they'll do that.
So for laptops, is it just one laptop?
I believe you can use it on multiple devices because you do get a code, like a license key, but I haven't actually tried it, so don't hold me to that.
So I don't know if they changed it, but if you want, but otherwise if you go to multiple licenses, you have one computer, you can buy another computer as long as it's the same type, like it's a Mac, let's say, same type, but it changes over. And I'll get to a different type. You might have to twice, buy them twice.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you guys so much.